best to convince both Jews and Greeks about Jesus. Acts 18, verses 18 through 22. Paul stayed a while longer in Corinth, but then it was time to take leave of his friends. Saying his goodbyes, he sailed for Syria, Priscilla and Aquila with him. Before boarding the ship in the harbor town of Cenchrea, he had his head shaved as part of a vow he had taken. They landed in Ephesus, where Priscilla and Aquila got off and stayed. Paul left the ship briefly to go to the meeting place and preach to the Jews. They wanted him to stay longer, but he said he couldn't. But after saying goodbye, he promised, "I'll be back, God willing." From Ephesus, he sailed to Caesarea. He greeted the church there and then went on to Antioch, completing the journey. So all the way back up to Antioch in Syria. And this trip, it kind of amazes me, was 3 years. And if you think about it, because this is something we often mention to the confirmands, Jesus' original ministry was thought to have been about 3 years. So here we have somebody spending 3 years just trying to convince people of what that 3-year ministry had been about. So his second journey now complete, we now hear from Paul on personal terms in his letters to other church communities. And they're just that. They're letters. They're filled with greetings, with news, with important messages and themes. So hear his words from Romans chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, then 31 through 34, and then chapter 16, verses 3 through 5. So Romans chapter 8. The solution is life on God's terms. With the arrival of Jesus, the Messiah, that fateful dilemma is resolved. Those who enter into Christ being here for us no longer have to live under a continuous low-lying black cloud. A new power is in operation. The spirit of life in Christ, like a strong wind, has magnificently cleared the air, freeing you from a fated lifetime of brutal tyranny at the hands of sin and death. God went for the jugular when he sent down his own Son. He didn't deal with the problem as something remote and unimportant. In his Son, Jesus, he personally took on the human condition, entered the disordered mess of struggling humanity in order to set it right once and for all. The law code, weakened as it always was by fractured human nature, could never have done that. The law ended up being used as a Band-Aid on sin instead of deep healing of it. And now, with that law code asked for, but we couldn't deliver its accomplishment. And now that law code asked for, but we couldn't deliver, is accomplished as we, instead of redoubling our own efforts, simply embrace what the Spirit is doing in us. So what do you think? With God on our side like this, how can we lose? If God didn't hesitate to put everything on the line for us, embracing our condition, exposing himself to the worst by sending his own Son, is there anything else he wouldn't gladly and freely do for us? And who would dare tangle with God by messing with one of God's own chosen? Who would dare even point a finger? The one who died for us, who was raised for us, is in the presence of God at this very moment, sticking up for us. Romans 16, verses 3 through 5. Say hello to Priscilla and Aquila, who have worked hand in hand with me in serving Jesus. They once put their lives on the line for me, and I'm not the only one grateful to them. All the non-Jewish gatherings of believers also owe them plenty, to say nothing of the church that meets in their house. Say hello to my dear friend Appentus. He was the very first follower of Jesus in the province of Asia. And here from 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. You'll remember, friends, that when I first came to you to let you in on God's master stroke, I didn't try to impress you with polished speeches and the latest philosophy. I deliberately kept it plain and simple. First Jesus and who he is, then Jesus and what he did, Jesus crucified. I was unsure of how to go about this and felt totally inadequate. I was scared to death, if you want the truth of it, and so nothing I said could have impressed you or anyone else. But the message came through anyway. God's Spirit and God's power did it, which made it clear that your life of faith is a response to God's power, not to some fancy mental or emotional footwork by me or anyone else. We, of course, have plenty of wisdom to pass on to you once you get your feet on firm spiritual ground, but that's not popular wisdom, the fashionable wisdom of high-priced experts that will be out of date in a year or so. God's wisdom is something mysterious that goes deep into the interior of his purposes. You don't find it lying around on the surface. It's not the latest message, but more like the oldest. What God determined as the way to bring out the best in us long before we arrived on the scene. The experts of our day haven't a clue as to what the eternal plan is. If they had, they wouldn't have killed the Master of God, designed life on a cross. That's why we have this scripture text. No one's ever seen or heard anything like this. Never so much as imagined anything quite like it, what God has arranged for those who love him. But you've seen and heard it, because God, by his Spirit, has brought it all out into the open before you. The Spirit, not content to flit around on the surface, dives into the depths of God and brings out what God planned all along. Who ever knows what you're thinking and planning except you yourself? The same with God, except that he not only knows what he's thinking, but he lets us in on it. God offers a full report on the gifts of life and salvation that he is giving us. We don't have to rely on the world's guesses and opinions. We didn't learn this reading by books or going to school. We learned it from God, who taught us person to person through Jesus, and we're passing it on to you in the same firsthand, personal way.
Please join me in the spirit of prayer. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. So you might have figured out that our weird lectionary is going through Paul's missionary journeys right now. So last week we had Paul's first missionary journey. This week we have Paul's second missionary journey. The week after we have Paul's third missionary journey. And as Seth mentioned, those are captured in the book of Acts. So Acts tells us about Paul's travels and the early church. And then we have all these letters that were written by Paul or attributed to Paul. They're disputed who they were written by. And so 1 Corinthians, Romans, we have readings from those interspersed to give you a sense of the kind of communication Paul had going back and forth with these communities. Paul is a controversial figure in early Christianity. To unpack Paul, we would be here until maybe next year. So we're not doing that this morning. I want to be clear, that's not a statement about whether I agree or disagree with some of the theology that's in the readings. But this morning we're going to talk about journey and the idea of having the passion to journey and tell this story in an interpersonal way. So the journey is 3,000 miles, this one, the second mission trip that Paul takes. It cracks me up because when we went to Texas, people were tired that we drove from eastern Texas to San Antonio, which was maybe 200 miles, right? This is 3,000 miles with no cars, right? They have boats, horses or donkeys, and their feet, basically, is what they have going on here. 3,000 miles. And so in the United States, if you think about that, that's from Portland, Maine. It's about from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon, right? I don't even like taking that plane flight. Never mind walking that far. And so I just wondered as I read this morning what those journeys were like, especially if you come into a place where you don't really know anyone and you have something you want to share, this peculiar story of Jesus. I wonder how Paul got people to listen to him, never mind become followers of Jesus. I'm guessing Paul was the best community organizer ever, right? No matter where you were or who you were, if you found yourself in a conversation with Paul, he would find a way to make sure that he talked to you about Jesus. You've met these people, right? not talking to you necessarily about Jesus, but you get on the plane and you sit next to someone and it becomes clear like there's something they are just so passionate about that they tell everyone they meet. It's his passion. It's his passion to tell people about Jesus. Now, most of you know that in our household we have twin teenage sons who are 14, and they are lucky enough to have passions. So we have one who is a passionate golfer, that's Russell, and Nate is a passionate musician. And if you, by some grace of God, get them to have a conversation with you, which those of you who have had teenagers realize that that's a small miracle, to get them to have a conversation with you. But if you do get them to have a conversation with you, I guarantee you the things they'll want to talk about are either golf or music, right? So Russell will talk to you all about the finer points of golf, which I tried to make up in my sermon. I didn't do a very good job. I should have just asked him. I said things like how far back your swing should go, putting the pin in or the pin out when you putt, the new out-of-bounds rules, how to put spin on the ball, how to adjust the golf course so that if you play it 3 times back to back to back, you make it more interesting and more exciting for yourself, etc., etc., etc. You get the point. He could go on and on and on about that. And if you end up in a conversation with Nate about music, he will implore you to sit and listen to every piece of music he has ever listened to. So I don't recommend it. This is the effect of Spotify on the new generation. So Nate is a huge fan of music. He goes into Spotify, which is kind of a search engine for music. If you don't know about it, he'll listen to something, and the beautiful thing is it'll say, if you like this, you might like that. So you know what Nate does? He goes down that endless rabbit hole of what you might like, and he would like to share every song he finds with you. Not a question. None of which you have ever heard before. Yes. Or you may never want to hear them again. So I'm going to guess that for most of us, telling people about Jesus is not our passion. I bet you have a passion, though, so think about what that is and how it feels different, right? When you have a passion. And I'm guessing a lot of us have barely told our friends who don't go to this church about our faith, never mind chosen to travel 3,000 miles by foot just to tell every person you happen to run into about this good news. In 2019, the Barna Institute ranked Portland, Auburn, Maine as the second most post-Christian city in the country. What is post-Christian, you may ask? I'm going to tell you what their criteria are, and I'm going to be honest that when I use their criteria, I am also post-Christian, which I don't agree with, so just keep that in mind. But you can keep score for yourself for fun. So to qualify as post-Christian, individuals had to meet 9 or more of the following factors. If you meet 13 or more, you're highly post-Christian, whatever that means. Okay, so here are their criteria. Do not believe in God, identify as atheist or agnostic, disagree that faith is important in their lives, have not prayed to God in the last week, have never made a commitment to Jesus, disagree that the Bible is accurate, have not donated money to a church in the last year, have not attended a Christian church in the last 6 months, agree that Jesus committed sins, do not feel a responsibility to share their faith, have not read the Bible in the last week, have not volunteered at church in the last week, have not attended Sunday school in the last week. Do you see a theme here? These guys have super committed people, clearly, because they're using in the last week as their measure. If we had that, we'd just be booming all the time. Have not attended a religious small group in the last week. Have not read the Bible in the past week and disagree strongly or somewhat that the Bible is accurate, and are not born again. So these are the criteria that they use. So I disagree with a lot of these criteria. You may or may not disagree with them. But the one that I did want to highlight was one that I think many mainline denominations struggle with, and that is feeling a responsibility to share the faith. And I imagine that responsibility is what fueled Paul's long journeys to share the good news. I recognize that we live in a different world from Paul, and the effect of technology is that we are more aware of the world around us than we ever would have been in the past. Many of us recognize that our religious identity is tied to history and culture, and we want to respect others' history and culture. We don't want to force our beliefs on anyone, and so we tend to be quiet. We tend to practice our faith privately. Yes, we may go to church, we may even be active in church activities, but we don't talk about those like we talk about our passion for golf or for music. It's not the thing that comes to us when someone asks what we like to do or what our interests are. And I want to be clear, I don't believe in converting people to Christianity. I don't believe someone's soul is doomed to hell if they don't accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior. And so I don't believe that we need to share our faith in order to rescue people from themselves. But I do know that my faith and my belief in the good news of God's love for all is what sustains me. And I think right now, at this point in the world, everyone is looking for something to sustain them. This world is a mess. People need to hear what we have to say. God's love for all has saved me from despair at various points in my life, and it has given me the presence and courage to do things in the world that I would have never done without it. Those experiences are worth sharing. We all have different reasons why we choose to share or not share about our experiences with God, our understanding of faith, and our understanding of the divine. But my prayer for all of us is that our connection to God through our faith is so sustaining, so life-giving, that we can't help but share the good news of God's love. Likely we won't travel across the country telling everyone we meet, but we can start just with the people in our everyday lives. May God bless us on this journey. Amen.